Hello, and welcome to KnowTalks, a collaboration between the United Nations Development Programme, or the UNDP, and the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Knowledge Foundation. This series of webinars aims to drive knowledge transfer while advancing the UNDP's Sustainable Development Goals. I'm Brandy Scott. I'm the host of the Business Breakfast on Dubai 103.8, and I am extremely pleased to be moderating this session of KnowTalks. As an author who writes books about one country whilst based in another country, whilst actually coming from a third country, I have a particular personal interest in our guest this afternoon. So I was extremely pleased to be asked to be here with you and to be asking her questions. Anne Morgan is the author of Reading the World, which is also published in the US as The World Between Two Covers. That nonfiction book is an account of her journey reading a book from every country in the world. She's a novelist as well, and Anne is going to speak to us this morning about what she learned during her reading odyssey, what reading widely can teach us about each other, especially at a time when we're all traveling and meeting a little bit less than we might be used to. Anne, I'm going to hand over to you. There will be time for questions at the end. By the way, we're going to have half an hour to put your questions to Anne. So if you think of things, message them in the Q&A and we'll be keeping an eye on that. Off you go.
Thanks, Brandy, and thank you everyone for having me today. It's a real honour to be taking part in what I'm sure will be a fascinating series of talks. As Brandy said, my first book, Reading the World, came out of a project called ayearofreadingtheworld.com. Now, when I started this project nearly 10 years ago, I had no idea that it would lead to a book. In fact, if you'd told me that 10 years later I would be sitting here talking to you about it today, I would have had no idea. I would have been completely blindsided, to be honest. It was a purely naive personal quest when this started. It came out of a realization that although I thought I was a very internationally minded person, my reading was very narrow. In fact, most of the books on my bookshelves were by a very narrow subset of people, mostly people who had English as a first language and lived in either the US or the UK. Now, when I realised this, I was quite shocked. And it was 2011 at the time, and a very international year was coming up for the UK. The Olympics were about to take place. So it seemed a very obvious time for me to try and correct this cultural blind spot by seeing if I could read a book from every country in the year. Now, I knew that there would be lots of challenges that I couldn't even imagine. But one thing was clear to me, as I knew basically nothing about literature from many parts of the world, I was going to need help. And so my first step to try and tackle this project was to launch a blog called ayearofreadingtheworld.com and write an appeal to readers and book lovers around the world asking for their help, asking them to suggest what I should read from different countries. Now, pretty soon I started getting messages, and very quickly these were messages from people I had no idea how they'd found me. They were all over the world. 3 days after I put this appeal online, I got a message that really started giving me an inkling of what this project would turn into and how life-changing it would be. And this was from a woman called Rafida in Kuala Lumpur. She said, "I love what you're proposing to do. Please, can I go to my local English language bookshop and choose your Malaysian book and post it to you?" Now, Rafida was as good as her word, and a few weeks later, a package turned up containing 2 books, not just a suggestion for Malaysia, but also one for Singapore that she and the bookseller had picked out for me. And I was incredibly humbled by this. It seemed extraordinary to me that a stranger 6,000 miles away had been moved to go to the trouble of going to a bookshop and then sending me books and posting them and all that just to help me out. But actually, what she did turned out to be the pattern for that year. Time and again, people all over the planet went above and beyond to help me achieve my goal of trying to read a book from every country in the world's most published language, English. And all sorts of things that I could never have asked for happened. Perhaps the most extraordinary example involved this book. Now, the sharp-eyed among you might notice that the title is not in English, A Casa do Pastor. In fact, none of the book is in English, it's in Portuguese, and there's a good reason for that. This is a book by a writer called Olinda Beja, who was born in Sao Tome and Principe, a Portuguese-speaking African island nation. And like 10 or so other UN-recognised nations at the time of my quest, that nation had no literature available in English translation. Now, that's significant because, as I mentioned earlier, English is the world's most published language. And as such, it's a kind of lingua franca for international literature. Not only does being published in English allow a huge global reach for a writer, but it also greatly increases their chances of being translated into other languages, because English is used by many publishers around the world as a sort of exchange market for stories. And if something is available in English, its chances of being picked up and translated into other languages are much greater. So if a nation like Sao Tome and Principe has no literature commercially available in English, then the chances of those stories reaching many parts of the world are very low. Now, in the case of most of the nations that had no literature in commercially available translation, when I was doing my quest, I usually managed to find some sort of workaround. In some cases, people sent me unpublished translations. For the Comoro Islands, for example, an academic who had, for fun, during his PhD, translated a novel by a Comorian author, shared the manuscript with me. But in the case of Sao Tome and Principe, I struggled. I could find nothing that would work as a book that I could read from that country. And in the end, in desperation, I put a call out on social media and asked if there might be anyone who would be willing to help me translate a book so that I could read it. Now, I had no idea whether anyone would be interested. It seemed like a ridiculous thing to ask people to give up their time to do. But what was extraordinary was that I was overwhelmed with people willing to help, people who could speak Portuguese and were willing to try and help me translate a book. And these were all sorts of people. Indeed, one of the most foremost leading translators in the world, a woman called Margaret Jewel Costa, who has translated Nobel Prize winners, contacted me and said, I've heard what you're trying to do, and I would like to offer to help. And so I found this short story collection and ended up with 9 volunteers. There were actually more volunteers than I could involve in the project in the end, but I had 9. Only one of them was someone that I knew personally. Everyone else was a stranger who had found me through the internet. And I divided up the stories and sent a copy to each of my volunteers. And within 6 weeks, I had the entire book translated for me to read. It was an extraordinary example of the generosity and excitement that people had about sharing stories, and was extremely humbling for me. Now, the project started to get some international attention with the Olympics and everything, and it led to a deal for my own book, Reading the World. And this picture means a lot to me because you might see from the name written on the envelope, Rafida. This was a picture that Rafida in Kuala Lumpur sent me when she received my package that I'd sent to thank her for sending me those books that really got the quest going once the book was published. And this is the shelf when I'd finished. This was New Year's Eve, 2012. Now, it's a bit misleading, this picture, because it's not the whole bookshelf. It's the central section with the Christmas lights on. And you can see there all the hard copies and some of the paper manuscripts, plus 53 books on the e-reader, which was the total number of books that I'd read that year, 197. I set out to read a book from all the 196 UN recognized nations, and then realised that there were a lot of territories not represented on that list, so allowed blog readers to choose one extra territory for me to read a book from. And that turned out to be Kurdistan in the end. Now, at this point, I thought I'd finished. You can see the champagne there ready to go. I thought I'd achieved my goal of reading a book from every country in a year, and that was it. I was going to disappear into the sunset. But the world had other ideas. And I found that people kept contacting me about books, and they still do pretty much every day. I receive messages about books, about things going on with stories in different parts of the world, projects, all sorts of different ventures. Many of the connections I built that year have continued and strengthened. This was a lovely moment for me when 4 of the volunteer translators came to my book launch. Margaret Jewel Costa standing next to me on my right, and 3 of the other very generous translators there as well. And I found that many of those connections have continued and spawned other projects. This woman, Sunita Balakrishnan, who is a journalist based in Delhi, was very influential in expanding my thinking on Indian literature and showing me another blind spot I had when I really hadn't considered how many books in India are written in languages other than English. And she prompted me to start exploring Indian literature in translation in one of the 21 other official languages apart from English in India, and the many unofficial languages that are spoken there. And this, for her, our dialogue opened her mind to how little awareness there is of the richness of Indian literature in languages other than English. And so she launched her own project, Reading Across India, to start to address this. And even now, I hear repeatedly from people around the world doing projects, taking the idea off in all sorts of different directions. A couple of months ago, I recorded a surprise celebratory message for a high school in Sydney who has dedicated a term to reading books from different countries and exploring stories in different ways, and had given prizes to story ambassadors who were particularly good at covering literature from different countries. And for me, it meant traveling to many different places and engaging with readers and writers around the world. This was a message I was sent from some language students in a language school on the border with China in Far East Russia, who wanted to tell me about a book that they thought I should read. And this is quite normal for me. At the moment, I'm getting video messages from children at a school in Beijing who are telling me about books that they think I would like, including a physics textbook that explains why tomatoes are very dangerous, which sounds particularly intriguing. But perhaps one of the most powerful things that's come out of the quest, as far as I'm concerned, one of the things that I'm most delighted about, is that it prompted a number of translators and activists to try and address some of the gaps that I found during my year. Those 11 UN recognized nations that had no literature available in English translation. And this is one example. This is a novel from Guinea-Bissau, which at the time of my quest had nothing available, and I ended up reading a collection of essays by an activist from that nation, because there were no novels published in English from there. This novel was found by the translator Jethro Suter, who set out to address that, and he brought this into English, and it's very exciting to see it. Another example here from Madagascar, a nation of 22 million people that had no literature available in the world's most published language. And until a few years ago, the translator Alison Charette went and found a story that she could bring into English. Now, I'm often asked about this quest, what did I learn? And I think when people ask me that, they think that there might be some sort of uber story that you could distill from all the world's literature, that if you just read widely enough, there'd be some sort of hidden message that you could draw out of world literature. Now, if that's true, it needs a brain much bigger than mine, and someone who's able to read far, far more widely than I've been able to do in the last 10 years. However, there are some very important things that this quest has taught me. The first is that storytelling is a universal human impulse. And that is an incredibly powerful thing. We all tell stories, whoever we are, whatever our religious beliefs, whatever our political persuasion, wherever we find ourselves in the world, we tell stories in different ways, and we are incredibly excited by seeing people engage with the stories that we tell. It means something to people when someone is interested in their stories. I saw this over and over again, not just with the people sharing stories with me or going to great lengths to translate things or write things or send me books, but also the people who followed the project and joined in with comments. When I wrote about the Andorran writer Albert Salvado on the blog, I was overwhelmed. A rush of comments came on to the blog from Andorrans who were so excited to see someone paying attention to this man who was a national treasure in their eyes. And one commenter told me that if he wrote in English, he would be more famous than Dan Brown. There was so much excitement, and it seemed extraordinary to me that people in another part of the world would go to the trouble of writing comments in a language that wasn't their own, registering to this project, simply to share this excitement. But time and time again, I saw this. People are so fascinated. And I think that's a really important thing to hold on to, because as we face so much that we have in Anglophone literature, how they are and how they don't exist in other languages. So in French, for example, crime literature routinely wins high literary prizes, whereas in the Anglophone world, it's regarded as a little bit cheap and commercial, and you wouldn't get a crime novel winning the Booker Prize probably, although you never know. And so it was a mixture of things. Many of the books I read were literary novels, but there were plenty of exceptions. There were some crime novels, and sometimes that was fascinating to see how differently a genre worked in different parts of the world. In South America, for example, I found I was recommended a number of crime novels that didn't play out how I expected a crime novel to work. Things didn't tie up neatly at the end. The bad guys didn't get caught. We didn't find all the answers. And much as I was saying about not knowing, my initial response was, these aren't good books. This hasn't worked out properly. This isn't properly plotted. Until someone pointed out to me that with the history of corruption and the many issues that many South American nations have faced, a crime novel such as we're used to would feel unrealistic to readers there. It's just not the way it works. It would feel like a fantasy. And so those crime novels were a much more realistic representation of the reality of crime in those countries, which was fascinating to me. It's how stories work and what they're expected to do. The expectation isn't always the same around the world.
Oh, that is interesting. Tell me about the logistics, though, of actually reading. How did you plot your progress and make sure you didn't accidentally leave 2 countries off the list? Was there an Excel spreadsheet involved anywhere here?
Well, so on the blog, there is the list of the countries, and as the recommendations came in, I recorded them there. And I had the whole list of countries from the start, so I could see where the gaps were. I was working full-time freelancing at the Guardian newspaper, so I didn't have a lot of time. So I had to be quite disciplined. And I realized that if I read 4 books a week, I would be reading slightly faster than I needed to read to make sure I got through all the books in the year. And so I had to read 1 book every 2 days, 3 times a week, and 1 book in 1 day on a Saturday. And so I'd save a short book for the Saturday, and then I had to read half a book every other day, or all the other days. And I would read on my commute, and I would read in the evenings, and sometimes on my lunch break as well when I was up against it. But the reading was only half the challenge, because I also had to do all the research to find the books, to go through the suggestions that people made, and then write the reviews on the blog. So I think each day it was probably taking me about 6 hours a day, 6 to 8 hours a day. And I would get up early before work as well. I would do things. But what was extraordinary was time and again, people did surprising things that made it easier. I would log on to my email at 6 o'clock in the morning and find that someone had taken it upon themselves to research Laos for me and come up with some suggestions. And that was amazing. Just strangers out there getting involved and willing me on, and they really kept me going. It was like running a marathon and having the crowd cheering around you and knowing I had to do this because all these people had invested in it.
What effect did that have on your personal life? If you're reading for 6 hours a day, I mean, that doesn't leave an awful lot of time for cooking, cleaning, and significant others.
No, I was very lucky. My other half was very generous in taking a lot of that on, and in fact he proposed to me that year, so it can't have been that bad. But yeah, I was very boring for a year. I think I didn't do a great deal else. I sort of had a kind of mini lockdown, I think, that year. A good rehearsal, but yeah, it wasn't my most lively year.
There you go. Maybe that's a perfect pandemic activity. Did you get fatigue at any point? Was there any point that you just thought, I can't go on, I've had enough?
There was, funnily enough, it was towards the end of the year when it was November, and I saw that I was going to do it. I saw that I had all the books and I knew that I could do it. And that was the point where it hit, because it was almost like the penultimate mile of a marathon. That sort of, I've done it, I've proved it to myself, but I still got to keep going. And that's when I really had to, and which was strange, because by that point I had the deal to write the book, and I'd actually eased down my freelancing, so I had more time. But for some reason it then was harder. But again, it was people being part of it that really saw me across the finish line. That was the real difference for me.
We're getting a couple of questions, and I'm going to meld some of them together because some of them are quite similar.
Sorry to interrupt, Anne, can you please stop sharing your screen?
Oh yes, of course.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
yes.
Thank you.
So I'm going to put a couple of questions together that are similar. Some people are asking about the different challenges in reading, whether or not it was difficult, Amal, for example, of following characters' names and who is who when they are in different languages. Other people asking whether or not you found some of the cultural concepts in different books difficult to follow.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think that is a challenge. Names I didn't struggle with so much, although I do find generally as a reader in books where there are huge casts of characters, I often struggle, whatever the names are. And there were some massive novels I read that had lists of characters at the beginning that you would use. In terms of the cultural questions, a very, very good one. And yes, and there were some books that I read where I really honestly didn't know how to interpret certain things. Particularly, this would be the case of when a ritual was described. So I'm thinking, for example, some of the West African literature I read, some of the folk tales had descriptions of wedding nights that were quite violent, the brides being held at knife point and almost the wedding night being like a battle. And when I read those, I didn't know whether I was supposed to understand it as something shocking that was happening to those people or whether it was a ritual that was culturally normal. And that is a challenge reading the world. And I think it's something that I'm conscious whenever I'm reading literature from a tradition that is not familiar to me, is to have a sort of reader behind my reader who makes a note of these things in my mind and thinks, okay, that's something I don't understand. I mean, I could research and look further into, but at the moment I have to reserve judgment on that. And sometimes the story will tell you, sometimes it will be obvious later what that meant. Other times it won't, but that is part of the reward, part of what's fascinating about it. Again, seeing where the edge of your limits, that your knowledge is, and what you do, how you cope beyond that.
Hey, and again, a couple of people have asked versions of the same question here. How many countries you visited yourself, and whether the reading has inspired you to visit any of the countries the books were from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm lucky that before the pandemic, I did travel a fair bit, and since reading the world, I've been invited to a number of countries, including to Dubai to talk at the Knowledge Summit a few years ago, which was wonderful. So I've been lucky to do that, and also when I was younger, I travelled a fair bit. In terms of visiting countries, I love travelling, so yes, but I think I'm particularly intrigued by Bhutan from the novel I read there, from there, The Circle of Karma, which was a novel about a woman on a Buddhist pilgrimage. She spent a lot of time in northern India, but also in Bhutan, and what I read and saw through her eyes was really fascinating. It was really interesting to be taken so deeply into the mind of someone holding different religious beliefs and to see how the world looked to her. So I would be fascinated to visit Bhutan, certainly, yeah.
There are a couple of theories about plots and books. One is that there's actually only 2 plots in the entire world. Someone goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. There's another theory that there are only 7 plots in the world, whether they're quest stories like Lord of the Rings or mystery stories. Did you find that you were effectively reading the same plot over and over? What would you add to those theories?
I think there's some truth in the idea that there are certain commonalities, coming of age stories, people in search of something. Many of the stories I read were about people looking for a better life for their children, or love. Love was a big theme. However, I think it's more complicated than that. It may be true of Anglophone novels, but I think, as I said before, the way that stories work and what they're expected to do in different parts of the world is not always the same. There's a lovely example with the Sherlock Holmes novels, which are massive in China. China is a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes, and they were published in Chinese very soon after they were published in English. But what was fascinating is that the early Chinese translations changed the titles to give away the twist in the plot. So one of the stories was titled The Belly Found in the Jewel of the Goose in the Chinese version, and another one was called The Jealous Woman Who Murdered Her Husband. And as an English language reader, you think, why on earth would you do that? Because surely you read those stories for the twist, to find out what happened. And if someone gives it away, you'd be annoyed. But it turned out that the reason those stories were initially so popular was that the Chinese authorities thought that they would be a good way of learning about about English detection techniques. And so they were seen as didactic and as educational rather than as being page turners. And in fact, a lot of Chinese crime fiction is quite didactic. There's a judge who writes crime fiction who has been translated into English, but he sees his mission as teaching people about the judiciary and how it works. That's the primary purpose. So if you're telling a story to educate rather than to intrigue, that makes it work quite differently. So I think that there has to be some extra layers to that.
How has, and again, a couple of people have asked this in different ways, how has all of the reading you did through that year from different cultures impacted your own writing? Because you're also a novelist. Did it change you as a novelist?
Oh, totally. I mean, I actually wasn't a published novelist until after this quest. Reading the World was my first book. I had struggled for about 10 years trying to write a novel and had written unpublishable things, basically. And having read all these stories, it really opened me up as a writer. It made me much braver, much more adventurous. And I had this story idea that had been in my mind for 5 or 6 years, and I sat down and wrote it after reading The World, and that became my first novel beside myself. So yeah, it was transformative, absolutely transformative, seeing, because the ways of imagining the images that we used, the possibilities of what stories could do was so much larger than what I'd been used to.
You mentioned your translators there, your circle of translators that you put together. And translation is one of those things that we don't think about when we're reading. I mean, there are prizes for translation, and rightly so. What did the quest sort of teach you about translation? What did you come away knowing that you didn't necessarily know before?
I came away with a huge respect for what translators do, and I'm very pleased to see that in the last 10 years there's been increasing recognition for translation. There's been a campaign on Twitter, #NameTheTranslator, because very often translators aren't named on the covers of books that they've translated, which is crazy when you think about it, because they're the person who wrote the words in the book. And that is starting to change. And I'm really pleased to see that. I wrote a chapter in my book thinking about translation and what it means. And one of the very interesting things about translation is that whenever you talk to translators about it, whenever you read books about it, people come up with all sorts of grand metaphors for what it is, for, you know, trying to explain it, ventriloquizing, or whether it's pouring liquid from one shaped jar into another jar, or all sorts of things, or the Babel fish idea. For me, it's very interesting. People can't almost translate what translation is, but for me, I came up with the conclusion that when you're reading a translation, you're really reading with someone else's eyes. A translator is lending you their eyes to read with, and that's an incredible gift. It's very generous, because what they have to do is they have to take the story in, understand it, and then put it into a language that, as nearly as possible, it makes an equivalence of what's happening in that story and what it means. And there's so many subtleties to what words mean and the associations that they have in particular cultures, that it's a really fine art.
We're getting asked quite a lot, and I don't want to put you on the spot because you did this 10 years ago, and so I mean, it would be cruel to ask you to reel off a list of books that you read, but we are getting a lot of questions about the Arabic writers that you read, and from this part of the world. What can you tell me about what you read in this part of the world and the impact it had on you?
Well, actually, there were some really, really interesting books that I read. From the UAE, my choice was Mohammed Al-Moor, a short story collection called The Wink of the Mona Lisa, which was really interesting. It had a number of, short story collections were really wonderful during that year because they were so many different snapshots and so many different voices. And that collection was such a fascinating range of pictures of life in the UAE. One of the books that was really transformative for me, and actually which I took an epigraph from for my book, was a book called The Corsair by Abdulaziz Al Mahmoud from Qatar, which was translated into English by Amira Nawera. And the quote that always stood out from me was, you would think differently if this land was your land and if these people were your people. And that's something that almost sums up for me what the quest meant. His novel was really fascinating because it was about the battle to control the trade routes in the Persian Gulf, and was one of those that showed how treacherous the British often were in these situations. And I had a very interesting discussion with him about it. But actually that discussion was really illuminating, because I was saying to him, oh, the British were so terrible, and and he admitted that he'd actually made them more sympathetic in the book than they were in the research that he found, to try and make the story more palatable. But when I was trying to say, oh, they were the real villains, he wasn't very impressed with that, and he just said, oh well, the Portuguese were much worse. I'm doing some more research. And I found it so interesting, because my instinct was to try and put my nation at the center of the story. If it couldn't be the hero, it had to be the villain, the worst of the worst. Britain was the worst. And to him, it was just another player in his story, not that important. That was a real lesson for me, that we all, wherever we are in the world, we put ourselves at the center, we put our country at the center. And for those of us in Northern Europe, there's a particular challenge in that the maps that we've grown up with, many of them, the Mercator projection maps, put Europe at the centre, and they also inflate the Northern Hemisphere, because it's impossible to represent a globe on a flat piece of paper accurately. So there has to be some mathematical fudging. And traditionally what we've done is to expand the Northern Hemisphere so that the North looks more important, bigger, stronger. Europe is in the center. And you realize quite how bad the distortion is when you look at the map and see that Greenland is the same size as Africa in many of those depictions. But actually, in reality, Africa is 14 times the size of Greenland. And that shows you quite the distortion that we have all lived with for a long time, particularly in the global North, I think. So that was a big lesson.
Here's a question we've got in for you. If you were doing this again, and it is nearly 10 years since you've first done your quest, what would you do differently?
That's a really good question. Funnily enough, when I was in Dubai, someone came up to me and said, oh, I think you should do your quest again, and you should do women writers. And since that year, since my quest, there is a woman in Australia actually who has done a project reading the world. She and I are in touch, and she's read a book by a woman from every country, and she recently finished it actually.
She had a story in The Guardian actually last week.
That's right. And which is fantastic, and she's done a great, it's an absolutely brilliant. What would I do differently? I think the funny thing is I'm sort of continuing the quest, because I am choosing a book a month and doing a review a month. And so often what I'm doing with those is sometimes I'm trying to correct or challenge my original choices. There are a few choices that I made quite naively at the start that I wouldn't necessarily choose now. Some of them were a bit obvious. With my blog now, I try to avoid the bestsellers and the books that have had a lot of publicity and a lot of readers, unless there's a really good reason for reading them, not because they're not going to be good, but because I'm interested in what's less well represented and bringing those things to the fore. So I think I would probably look a bit harder for less obvious choices than some of the obvious choices I made, although many of the choices I made were quite unusual and strange and controversial. And in fact, one big challenge I had, because starting off, a lot of people were recommending me books in the case of countries that didn't have much available by British or American writers who had lived there for some time. And so to challenge this, I didn't feel comfortable with that, and I avoided that in almost every case. But to challenge that, I actually chose for my American book a book by a writer called Neil Gaiman, who is British, but has lived in America for 20 or 30 years and has American children and is married to an American. And I thought, okay, let's test Will Americans accept this as an American book? And in the end, I came to the conclusion that the novel I chose, American Gods, which is a kind of road trip novel, it's built on the model of the American road trip novel in many ways, but with a twist, with a sort of supernatural twist. I came to the conclusion that that probably was an American book by a British writer, but I wanted to see what the reaction would be, and where is the line? And I think it's blurry. Classifying things by nations is problematic because most of us don't stay put. We move around, we have different influences. And as the world becomes ever more globalized, I think that's going to become more and more problematic. So, yeah.
And American Gods is now an Amazon series, isn't it? And you don't get much more American than that. Talk to us, and we've only got a few more minutes left with you, about the issues that you saw getting, as you said, some of those novels, if they're not in English, they never make it into sort of the global consciousness. And that can be an accident of geography, as you know, rather than quality. What needs to happen to get more global literature global?
I think lots of different things need to happen. It seems to me that the really exciting publishing is happening with small publishing houses these days. And I think there needs to be more support for that. We as readers can do our bit by being more adventurous, by showing publishers that we're ready to explore things. Publishers are often quite conservative. Mainstream publishers will be nervous of publishing things that they think people won't understand or they won't respond well to. And so often you get this, and I've seen this myself as a writer, this pressure to write what has worked before, to stay within your lane. And it can be difficult to change that. But yes, readers being more adventurous is a help. I think more support, more funding for small presses and for initiatives that allow voices to come to the fore is a good way of doing that. And also having more people from more diverse backgrounds making decisions, because much as I was talking about with the not knowing, sometimes we don't know. That's the thing. We just think something doesn't work because we don't understand it. And until you've got people who actually can explain why something works or why it's different, why things are done in certain ways, you miss out on that. There's a lovely example with Tayeb Salih, Season of Migration to the North. He wrote about how the early English translations were received and that they were dismissed. People were really rude and made all sorts of generalizations about Arabic literature and how it was episodic, and that's a masterpiece. That novel is an absolute masterpiece. And what's clear when you read those early reviews is that it was the reviewer not knowing how to read it was the problem, not the book. And so I think it's about having more, a greater range of voices involved at the table as well.
Well, reviewing is another point. I mean, there's been arguments over the year about the kind of fiction that ends up in the New York Times, for example. Jennifer Weiner has been a huge proponent of trying to get less serious books into more serious publications. What role does reviewing play in all of this?
I think it plays something of a role. I'm not sure it has quite the influence it used to, because newspapers are less widely read than they were, although of course online there is a lot of influence. For myself, I've been lucky enough to have books reviewed nationally in national papers and in the UK and the US, and I'm not sure it has a massive impact on sales, to be honest. I don't know how much of it. The blogosphere is actually often more powerful in some ways. It's interesting, with each book of the month, I include a link that people can go through to buy the book, and I can see, each time I do a review, people click and go to buy the book, and it's partly because there are people following the project and they are interested in the choices that I make, but. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you may have different views on that, but I think that reviewing definitely plays a part, but I'm not sure it's as important as it used to be.
And that blog, of course, is ayearofreadingtheworld.com. I'm looking at the New Zealand section here, and you've literally gone across the canon. Both of our Booker Prize winners are in there. So you're, even just from looking at my own country, the books that you're choosing are absolutely spot on. One last question. We've got 3 more minutes with you. And it's one that someone has asked, and I think it's absolutely lovely. How did reading the world change how you interact with people of different cultures? You obviously have lived in London, one of the great multicultural cities of the world. How did it change you?
I'm much more alive to complexity and to the fact that there is always another side, and that there may be things that I'm not seeing. I think I'm more humble in my interactions, less quick to judge, and more willing to be persuaded of a different way of looking at things. It's given me an open door to almost anyone I meet, because everyone I meet I have something in common with. There's a book I've read from that means something to them, or that they know something about, or I have some insight into their part of the world or their view on something, and that has opened many conversations. Taxi drivers I always end up having long conversations with, so it's connected me much more closely to people and made me much more able to get alongside them, I think.
Oh, look, fantastic. Anne Morgan, thank you so much for your time today on KnowTalks. The author of Reading the World, or if you are looking at a US cover, and this does show you the world of publishing and how it works, it's known as The World Between Two Covers. Anne's blog is ayearofreadingtheworld.com. She's also on social media. Thank you very much also to the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Knowledge Foundation and to the UNDP, which are the 2 organizations behind today's talk, and to all of you for your questions. 446 people listening to us today from around the world, which is absolutely magnificent, and totally in the spirit of what we have been talking about. And for those of you who have asked for book recommendations, and there are many of you from Anne, if you do go to her blog, it is a wash with recommendations and reviews. Shukran, thank you so much, Anne. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Brandy. Thank you for all the attendance. Shukran jazilan.